That super soldier program you've been working on for the last 8 years, for example. What would you say if I told you the president just authorized a $150 billion cash injection into your plans for a new Captain America? Today on the Comic Book Report, the Ultimates Omnibus 2022 reprint. Stick around and check it out. Greetings everyone, my name is Dominic and today you're tuning into the Comic Book Report, where we review comic books and graphic novels so you can get an idea of what to read. And today we're taking a look at the early 2000s classic, The Ultimates by Mark Millar and Bryan Hitch. The first two maxi series are bundled in this one omnibus edition and I can't wait to talk about it today. But before we do, if you're interested in getting your own copy, I encourage you to check out our channel sponsor, OrganicPriceBooks.com. You can use my code, TheComicBookReport, at checkout to receive $2 off of your purchase today. Please note if you use my affiliate code or links to make a purchase, I will earn a small commission, but it's a great way to support our channel at no additional cost to you. Thank you so much for considering. Now on with the show. First, some quick facts about today's collection. The issues in this volume were written by Mark Millar and illustrated by Bryan Hitch. The issues in this volume were published by Marvel Comics beginning in 2022. The volume itself collects Ultimates, issues 1 through 13, Ultimates 2, issues 1 through 13, Annual Number 1, and Ultimates 2, Issue 1 Variant Sketch Edition. This oversized hardcover comes in at 856 pages. At this time, I'd like to issue a general spoiler warning. I will be flipping through the contents of today's collection and commenting on plot points throughout. You've been advised. Okay, and here's our first look at that omnibus reprint from Marvel Comics. I'm happy to say that this is an oversized hardcover edition with a nice glossy print paper stock. The cover I have is the standard edition cover, but they did release a direct market cover for this release. I'll go ahead and do a quick snippet so you can compare. Overall, really love the dust jacket design. I think we get a great treat of Bryan Hitch's artwork that really gives you an idea of what you can expect from the inside. Love the dust jacket design, looks great on the bookcase. As we make our way to the back cover of the dust jacket, we have a bunch of thumbnails for the issues that are included that show you the cover of the issues. We see this a lot with a lot of these Silver Age omnibus releases from Marvel, but it's nice to see it as an added touch on some of the modern day omnibuses as well. I know I really like seeing it. Just a really clean look that again showcases a bunch of the artwork and what this omnibus contains. Now I'm going to go ahead and remove this dust jacket to give you a closer look, as well as a look at the interior flaps of the dust jacket before transitioning to the under the dust jacket artwork, which is a kind of wraparound image. I really like it. We're going to take a look at that in a second. I do want to note as well, if you noticed it on the back cover, this has been given a parental advisory. I believe just because instances of violence, maybe some language, and some sexualized situations. There's no outright nudity. They kind of hide it the best they can. But you know, it might not be perfectly intended for younger readers, so you've been advised on that as well. And now again, we're looking at that under the dust jacket artwork. Really love to see it. Again, you get Hitch's artwork here, really indicative of what you'll see throughout this entire omnibus. And I love that we have it stamped on the actual hardback book itself. Really nice modern touch we get with a lot of these hardcover editions lately. Always love to see it, all the bonus art. And the fact that it's kind of a wraparound cover, that's just incredible. And with that out of the way, we're going to go ahead and take a look at the binding for this omnibus. Now it is a sewn binding and it has quite a nice eye, at least mine does. So very little gutter loss here, which is great as it showcases the artwork almost seamlessly. Really enjoyed it. Yeah, a really great example of binding for these modern omnibuses, at least in my mind. Really happy with it, no complaints. And with that out of the way, we're going to go ahead and transition into the main book itself. As we make our way into the collection, we of course have the front matter, title pages, publication info, what it collects, before we jump into a brief introduction for the collection, which again was a nice added touch, and it kind of sets the stage for everything we're going to read before jumping into the Ultimates Volume 1. Before we get too far into this review, I do want to provide a bit more foundational or kind of contextual notes for this collection for those that might be picking it up for the first time. As I mentioned earlier, this essentially collects the first two maxi series for the Ultimates, and the Ultimates 2, both of which are 13-issue series. We also have that variant sketch edition as well as an annual that they shove at the back, but when you read this, you can essentially know that you're getting the first two maxi series for this Ultimates line. There were subsequent Ultimate stories, but they weren't by this creative team, so I think that them bundling these first two in an omnibus makes a ton of sense. For those that might not know as well, this is part of Marvel's Ultimate Universe. This is the same universe that had Brian Michael Bendis' Ultimate Spider-Man and the original Miles Morales run. There was also an Ultimate Fantastic Four, Ultimate X-Men, and a good other handful of Ultimate Comics issues. But you should know that this is not part of the mainstream Marvel 616 comic book universe, but rather its own side universe within the Marvel multiverse. Now, this universe does have a ton of fans, including myself. You might have seen some of my reviews on the Ultimate Spider-Man era, but this Ultimates run is also one of my favorites, and really it was my introduction to the Avengers. And before we get too much further, if you're enjoying this review so far and would like to see more comic book reviews, shorts, community polls, and so much more, please consider subscribing to my channel. I'd love having you around. Thank you for considering. Now let's get back to the review. So this is again in that Ultimates universe. One of my favorite things about the Ultimate universe is that it really was a refresh, relaunch for a contemporary audience. You don't have to get bogged down with decades of continuity and background reading. You could go in blank slate, making many of these Ultimate universe runs a perfect starting point for new readers. The Ultimates also has an added novelty, as I really believe this was a strong influence and or inspiration for much of the modern Marvel Cinematic Universe, or MCU. As you'll see within these pages, Nick Fury is depicted to look suspiciously like Samuel L. Jackson, and a lot of the incarnations of these characters are visually and kind of character-wise similar to some of their on-screen counterparts. This is definitely not surprising to me, as this was set in a more contemporary era, set in about the early 2000s. Granted, the MCU really started to flourish about a decade after that, but you can still see a lot of the bones here in this run. So I think if you're a fan of the films, this would definitely be a run that would capture your interest. I think something else that should be noted about this run is that the characters are very nuanced, complex, and inherently flawed. I think seeing a lot of these Silver or Golden Age heroes in the light we see them within the Ultimates is pretty jaw-dropping for those that were maybe grown up with some of those Silver Age comics, where we see more or less squeaky clean depictions of some of our heroes. The heroes in here, rather, have different layers to them, and some of the characters look, well, let's say less savory than we'd expect. I think Bruce Banner is a great example of this. His depiction of the Hulk, and even just his character as Bruce Banner, is certainly interesting. I think seeing Hank Pym along with Janet Van Dyne, their relationship is marked with even domestic abuse within the pages of this, so that could be a trigger warning for some. I guess what I'm getting at generally is that the characters are less standard than you might expect for a premier superhero book, in that they have a lot of layers to them. They have some real sense of conflict, even internally within the characters themselves, let alone within a dysfunctional team dynamic. And that's really what we have here. The first main arc of this is the gathering of the Avengers, or as they're called in this universe, the Ultimates, all the character conflicts that ensue because of that, and how they kind of establish themselves as Earth's premier superhero fighting team. They deal with stuff like PR and kind of optics on situations. One of their first missions happens when the Hulk gets loose and they have to stop him. And then basically after that, they're trying to keep it a secret that they have the Hulk on their team in any capacity. So just really interesting things like that. As far as storylines go for the Ultimates and the Ultimates 2, I don't want to get into too much detail here as far as spoilers go, because I'm really hoping you'll read this book for yourselves. It is a really great superhero story or two that I think a lot of modern audiences will appreciate. Another thing to note, if you haven't already, in the art style, there really is a kind of epicness in the scope. There is a cinematic quality to the art itself. The panel layouts are very almost widescreen presented. We have a lot of splash pages and two-page spreads, and sometimes more than that, which you'll see in a little bit. But the art is really a focal point for this run. I think the character models realized by Bryan Hitch have a kind of realism to them. There's not as much of a cartoony quality, at least in my mind, but it all lends itself to this very realistic modern approach that I've been talking about. I think that the art really helps inform the subject matter, because I don't think you could tell a gritty, complex story like this if you had overly animated artwork, unless you were making some kind of satirical point. So having this kind of art from Hitch, I think, really does lend a great service to the writing from Millar, and vice versa. I think that this story really shines, and from the moment one of this book, I mean, we start with a flashback sequence in World War II. There is a sense of gravity, there is a sense of realism. We have these realistically depicted battle scenes that, again, it's so evocative and grounding, and I think focusing really on the characters and the character dynamics really help make this story shine. Like I said, the characters are flawed, but in their way, very relatable, and I think because of that, you can maybe look at some of these heroes that you've seen even culturally, let alone other comic runs, in perhaps a new light. And I'm sure that that was really part of the heart of this whole Ultimate Universe, was to engage a whole new generation of audiences, and I think that this was ultimately successful in doing so, at least in my opinion. I know for me, one of the things within this run, though, that is a little funny, being that this is such a modernization and a refreshing take, is that this was written in 2002, at least the first arc was, and so the fact that this book is already somehow over 20 years old is really just eye-opening. But you do see some marks of age when you see how some subject matter is handled throughout this volume, but also some of the pop culture references. Like, there's a whole plot point that has to do with Freddie Prinze Jr., who was more of an it celebrity at the time. Not that he's not still relevant and great, but it's much more of a pop culture reference that would have been a harder hit back in the early 2000s. And I just use that as an example that there are these sprinklings of pop culture isms or like time capsule things from early 2000s that, while they were meant to modernize, those same things also can make it feel a bit dated. So that's something else to consider when you read this. There are a couple throwaway pop culture references like that that will surely just kind of show the age of this book. But overall, I do think that this is still a really refreshing relaunch of some of our favorite heroes. I think seeing some of the characters, like I said, in many ways in a new light is something I appreciated. I think overall, Captain America, for the most part, feels like a Captain America I would believe as a person. I think one of the most interesting facets of how he's depicted in this collection is that he's a bit more of a brazen soldier, which is fun to see. I think that also his relationship, kind of entanglement with Janet Van Dyne, the Wasp, was definitely an interesting wrinkle as well. I didn't anticipate upon first reading. There's a weird love triangle between him, the Wasp, and Giant Man or Ant-Man Hank Pym. Iron Man, again, feels like that sort of futurist industrialist. He has kind of a zest for life, and I really liked that. You could see some obvious charisma that character had in this book. Sure, he's not Robert Downey Jr., but it's a really lively incarnation of our favorite Golden Avenger. Along with that, Thor, again, also was a good standout for me. He has kind of this wildness to him and this kind of hippie feel that I've never really seen depicted before in a Thor comic. Granted, I'm no expert on Thor, but I thought that the version we got within the pages of the Ultimates was one that definitely was striking to me in a different way. I do think I really enjoyed how they handled the Hulk throughout this. We definitely see a very flawed Bruce Banner. I would say his character is definitely not likable, but some of the kind of story elements that he got caught up in were certainly interesting to read, and I did enjoy him whenever he was in a scene. They definitely did a lot with Wasp. I think that they made her much more like a sort of pixie or a kind of fairy-like character, as far as she didn't have the tech. She like physically had these wings growing out of her. She was often played shrunken, and a big plot point in that first Ultimate storyline has to do with her capture and ultimate rescue. A very interesting set of characters. I already touched upon how Nick Fury is kind of depicted to look very much like a young Samuel L. Jackson. This was certainly a departure from the standard Nick Fury we've seen in just a lot of decades of mainstream comics. I do think that that was a fresh take, as as well on those characters. As we progress further into the story, we see characters like Black Widow and Hawkeye, who look almost like they stepped right out of the set of The Matrix, which I thought was kind of funny as far as their costuming and character design. As we go further in the collection, we see even more characters for the Ultimates, like Quicksilver and Scarlet Witch, although their dynamic was not one I particularly enjoyed in this collection. But overall, characters were all really solid. We got to see so many of the mainstay core Avengers team we've come to know throughout the years. Of course, this way in their new, fresh mix-up as the Ultimates in this universe. I think also having the Avengers as effectively kind of a government-sanctioned team of heroes was also a very novel approach. I know when we see in the Marvel Cinematic Universe how they're kind of under S.H.I.E.L.D., it's definitely something that was a familiar visual to see, but I think just seeing further regulation of that within the Ultimates was definitely kind of a wrinkle I didn't maybe anticipate when I first read this, but I liked seeing it. I liked to see how this team was sort of organized or sort of kept together. I did think the whole situation involving the Hulk, where he gets loose and just goes on a path of destruction that the Ultimates have to stop, was a really fun way to take a nod at the first Avengers story, which had the Avengers fighting off against the Hulk, but in a new and kind of realistic way. Again, how they tried to distance themselves from the Hulk, where they didn't want the public to know. That's something that obviously comes out later in the Ultimates run within this book. But it was definitely a plot wrinkle that I really liked. I think that this really honors a lot of the stuff we see from that original Avengers era, but again, with a very refreshing new light. But I like how Millar paid homage to the history of these characters, and I think some of the character changes we see within the characters all really are kind of captivating. I think that the characters are much more interesting to anything we saw in the Silver Age from any of these heroes, and I think that someone who is maybe a modern comics reader trying to break into the Avengers, I think short of something like Jonathan Hickman's Avengers run, which I think is just an absolute marvel, something like this might be an easier kind of on-ramp to get some of these Avengers characters that might be similar to something they've seen on screen without having to go through just years and years and years of continuity. Again, that is something I like about all of the Ultimates universe in general, is that it was kind of a soft refresh, rebirth, or reimagining of a lot of this comic continuity, but I think it's still so palatable for today, and I think that this is still one of my first and foremost recommendations for anyone trying to get into the Avengers. Again, the storylines themselves have plenty of twists and turns and so many character dynamics and wrinkles that I'm not even touching upon on this brief overview, but I will want to really leave that to a lot of you to read. If this looks like an interesting kind of concept to you, if you enjoy the art and you're looking for a title like this, I don't want to spoil too much for you. Suffice it to say, this is really rich ground here. This is such a fascinating set of stories, and I think that it's just really buoyed by all this incredibly gorgeous art that you've been treated to throughout this review. Like I said again, swinging back to the art, I love Bryan Hitch. I know Millar and Hitch are kind of a dream team for me. I really enjoyed some of their early Fantastic Four run that I've had the pleasure of reading, but this is some of their highlight reel for me. I love seeing it. I think that they're such a great, dynamic, creative duo, and I think you can see it really shine throughout the pages of this book. I also just love the way they frame a lot of the action. Like I said, it's very cinematic in scope. It makes everything feel truly epic. Every conflict feels larger than life, and it's almost like you're watching a storyboard of this gorgeous movie playing out in front of your eyes. I know that this really culminates in a gigantic spread that I love that they kind of replicated and prepared in such a way in this omnibus reprint. Basically, it's one long continuous image that would comprise several pages, and I know they could have done it in pairs of two, but instead we're treated to this kind of wrap out, pull out section of the omnibus that I'll show you momentarily, but it's just stunning. It's one broad scene of this epic battle towards the end of the collection, and you just have to see this to believe this. The fact that they did this in the omnibus, just absolutely brilliant. I mean, just look at the detail here. The fact that this is all represented in this way, just gorgeous. I think, again, you get that sense of scale and scope that Hitch and Millar are going for here, and the fact that we get to see this in this omnibus in this kind of pull-out fashion, what an added feature to this book. Really thrilled that Marvel published this like this. Very cool to see. At any rate, a really beautiful book here. Like I said, after the first two Ultimate Maxi series, we also have an annual and a boatload of extras at the end. I think one of the things I love about this book too, being such a fan of this run, is seeing all of those extras. I love all the character models. I think we get some scripts, some sketches, all of these just art galleries at the back. It's really a loaded extra section, at least in my mind, that helps round out this omnibus collection. Really, really beautiful stuff, especially if you love the artwork of Bryan Hitch. This is an invaluable set of extras. Really enjoyed it. So happy that Marvel presented it in this way. This may not be a perfect run or collection, but it has so much going for it. Yes, some of the ways it handled certain subject matters and some of the pop culture references are definitely a product of their time, but it's such a fresh modernization for some of these beloved characters, and I think it's such a great on-ramp for new and prospective readers, especially for those that really like the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I know for me, this was such an easy to read book. I loved when I first read it. Just the visuals are eye-popping, jaw-dropping, gorgeous, and I love that I didn't need to know a ton about the Avengers before checking this out. Granted, I've read subsequent Avengers runs, especially in the main 616 universe that I've also adored, but this one really stands out to me as just such a great way to dive into this franchise. And now that we've reached the end of this collection, all that's left is to give it a grade. For easily one of the most breathtakingly scoped, visually stunning comic books I have ever read that happens to showcase some of my favorite Marvel heroes of all time, The Comic Book Report happily gives The Ultimate Omnibus by Mark Millar and Bryan Hitch an A-. I've said it before and I'll say it again. If you're a fan of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, this might be a must-read recommendation. I think it's also great for fans that want to get into comic books but maybe don't know where to start, particularly if you want to get into a teen book. This is a great starting point for new readers. I know for one, I really appreciated this series. I think the characters are really layered and interesting, and the storyline has a way of just keeping you hooked. It's a great way to showcase those first two maxi series from the Ultimates, and I know for one, I'm happy to have this in an oversized format to showcase that incredible artwork. But let me know what you think of the Ultimates in the comments below, and thank you so much for watching. Until next time, this has been The Comic Book Report. Don't forget to give this video a like and comment, and please check out some of my other videos. Thank you so much. See you next time.